I think that Occupy Wall Street didn't go as far as it could have, and I think that um, I think it's an important thing to study in terms of analyzing why it didn't, especially in contrast to the Tea Party that was relatively in the same time period. And I will say personally, Occupy Wall Street has been one of the things that makes me nervous about how practical millennials will be. I mean, like, I hate saying, like, because I really love the ideals of Occupy Wall Street, and I loved it, but it's just like.
Let me help you out. You're talking about a leaderless movement. That was a big deal.
I mean, like, that's part of it, but just like not. Also, I mean, just like, just a lot of the structure, like having introductions that like it takes 20 minutes for everybody to say things before you even start having the conversation. And like I believe me, I'm all for the ideals that inspire these types of things, but it's like in terms of actually pragmatically getting anything done, I question it. And I'm not saying that maybe it is the way to go, but
yeah, it's.
I have my questions.
The older generation definitely believed it wasn't the way to go.
A
lot of people from the civil rights era basically saying you're not protesting and rebelling the right way.
I went to the Women's March a couple of times, and like even though like the first time was kind of a magical experience, it still felt like there was no leader. Like we were going after ideas or like a system, which there was no real plan on how to do that besides like just vote in November. Like, cool, but like what else could we do?
Or at Occupy Wall Street kind of like just being like we're too good to even be involved with politics. Like maybe people that were part of Occupy Wall Street will feel that I'm mischaracterizing that, but that was also kind of the sense that I got, was that and I think we see it a lot with a lot of, I'm like, obviously they're more involved with politics, or they seem to be more involved with the idea of being involved in politics than it's my perception of Occupy Wall Street was, but it's still kind of the idea that like we don't want to get, but Bernie is like the exception. Other than that, we kind of don't want to have to get too involved. We don't want to get into the nitty gritty dirtiness of politics.
Yeah, I'll expand on that a little bit because now you're touching on political behavior. And so, of course, there's the type of political behavior where you, of course, work with the system or within the system. So that's just typical voting. And depending on the group you're looking at, they have negative experiences with the institutions. And so they opt to, engage in activism and just other types of political behavior that, of course, aren't voting. We've talked about it a couple times before, but really you have to do both. I don't think I'm going through in my head here because there's plenty of books, there's plenty of course, interviews from people who are directly involved with Occupy Wall Street. And I think as far as, because we started this conversation talking about how, or I had mentioned how, coronavirus is going to affect the narrative for our generation. They went from, us talking about working in teams and the society sort of projecting on us what expectations they had for us. And now that narrative is starting to change more towards, oh, you guys seem to really be in a tough position here. And we know that as far as, I guess, having negative interactions with the political system in the sense that we see the numbers as far as, millennials having lower numbers of not having as many assets, costs and expenses through the roof. And it doesn't seem like that's being addressed politically by a large portion of people. Of course, post 2020, we see that we at least had two candidates in the race who pretty much from the beginning talked about this. But of course, the next step is actually getting people permanently engaged so that when we have an opportunity to put people in government or in positions of power, that we actually do that. I don't really see this turning out like Occupy Wall Street, just because that seemed a lot more restricted to just like activist groups, where I see this hitting a much broader segment of people.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, so,
go ahead.
I just really quickly, I just wanted to say too, I think one thing that when I'm talking to people, I try to emphasize too, is that we talk about activism, we talk about voting, but there's also the in between of, but before voting is even being involved in selecting candidates. And I mean, I think obviously, and the Justice Democrats are associated with the Democrats, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm citing the Justice Democrats because they're Democrat, they're aligned with the Democratic Party, but just like the idea. Well, one reason why I consider them like a bright spot, just in terms of, regardless of how you feel about their ideology, is that I feel like they get the idea of being involved in the process of who even is on the ballot, as opposed to just saying like we need to show up and vote or we need to do activism. Like everybody loves to complain about how awful the choices we have are at the ballot, and it's been nice to see a group saying it's not simply about voting, it's about we need to become more involved in selecting who is even on that ballot to begin with before we're even talking about who we should vote for. And I that's one thing that I've considered to be a bright spot recently.
Well, see, in my opinion, the failing of Occupy Wall Street was that they were caught in between two contradictory messages. You've got to disrupt stuff, but you can't be destructive. And the problem in that is that they were kind of resigned themselves to camping out in a park, where in decades past, protest meant a certain level of destructive behavior. That's why people don't want protests in their town, right? That's why you ultimately appease protesters, is because there is a certain amount of destruction. But we have relegated this thought. We've moved the bar on violence so far that violence is now no longer just actions against people. You throw a rock through a Starbucks window in Seattle in 1999, and that's a violent protest. That Starbucks was closed. Period.
The CVS comes to mind when, was it Baltimore? It was Black Lives Matter.
In Freddie Gray's neighborhood, they, of course, the CVS, the only one in the neighborhood, was set on fire. And
Antifa throws over trash cans. But yet no one dies, to my knowledge. I'm not sure, but I don't remember.
I am. Nobody has ever died in an Antifa-related event, and now those frequently do have violent aspects to them, right?
Yeah.
But nobody has died.
But the media loves to focus on that trash can that's toppled over,
right,
for the whole 24-hour cycle.
I guess.
But I mean, if the guys in Zuccotti Park had walked across the street to the parking garage where all the Wall Street guys, parked their cars, and they flipped over a few Maseratis, we might be singing a different tune.
I mean, I think that I know that people will debate what impact Malcolm X and the Black Panthers had on making Martin Luther King and the nonviolent movement more acceptable to white people. And so I know people will say that, well, maybe violence was helpful, even though it was Martin Luther King and the nonviolent activists who were actually involved talking with politicians to actually move the agenda forward. But I mean, to me, I think that the nonviolence movement doesn't get enough credit for how much it was the nonviolence movement specifically that helped move it forward. And then when you had Martin Luther King get killed, you started having the riots. That didn't push the agenda forward. What you had was a backlash, because now people were saying we need to move to the right so that people stomp these violent activists. And then we got Nixon. And so, I mean, I understand the idea, but
the civil rights movement was a confrontational movement, right? The difference between
with nonviolence,
right?
Yeah,
but
it doesn't mean that it wasn't destructive.
Yeah,
it was destructive in a different way with boycotts and
you know, you were
civil
still
disobedience. They were doing civil disobedience, but they weren't rioting.
But they were breaking the law. You know,
yeah.
I mean, they were going into establishments and refusing to sit where they were instructed to sit.
Mm-hmm.
Right,
but it was nonviolent.
And even though, it was nonviolent. Yeah. If instead of flipping over those cars, if they had walked into the floor of the New York Stock Exchange and started yelling out numbers and telling people to buy and sell, and creating chaos, that is nonviolent, but it is quite destructive, and it would be awesome. I mean,
that sounds amazing. Why didn't we do
that? Doesn't it? Why didn't someone think to do that?
That charged up all of a sudden.
Put everything in vines. Put everything in vines.
I don't think you'd see the type of backlash against Occupy Wall Street if they had done that, to sit in and start going crazy in the stock exchange, versus if they were destroying people's cars and stuff. You know, I think there would be two very different reactions to how
I don't, because those stockbrokers, they'd rather lose a car than the millions that they would in the instant that somebody did that.
No, I'm just saying from the perspective of the general public.
And it's really hard. I think it's really hard now for people to boycott things. It's really hard. Yeah. And I don't know why it's so hard to just boycott things. It could be just the general pessimism, or like, oh, this isn't going to work. They're just going to keep making their money, blah, blah, blah. So
there's a lot of cynicism. I feel like there's a lot of, I don't know how it compares to other generations, but I feel like there's a lot of cynicism in the air, at least right now.
Here's
I think that's been around for a while.
Here's something that comes to my mind. So going back to Martin Luther King, so we talk about how he led a nonviolent movement, but violence ultimately killed him and took him away from the movement. And then let's flash forward to Black Lives Matter, which is another leaderless movement. I mean, we know the founders have made their faces known, but we don't have a modern Martin Luther King. And I'm wondering if that's a reaction to the fact that if we put our leader up front, you guys will kill him. You guys will take him away.
I mean, just remember, I don't know if you felt this way, but I think on Blackish, they did a good job of pointing this out.
I was just going to bring that up.
With Barack Obama, when he was first inaugurated and walking down the thing, I was like, do not shoot him. What are you doing? Why are you outside? Get back in your car. So when it comes, I think there's just this inherent fear that's just rippled through the decades of just we can't have a leader, because if we have one sole leader, then they're going to be taken away.
But the downside of not having a leader.
I was just going to say, for 8 years, I felt very, very scared for Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. Every single day, pretty much. I would think about, I am nervous for this human being, especially seeing the rhetoric on Fox News and in the conservative media. I was like, there's a reasonable chance he'll get killed. And I was very nervous pretty much every day about that.
I would say the downside of not having a leader is that there isn't a a person that's the face of the movement that could basically address the media and help frame the narrative. Therefore, if you
It's
get a
just a
couple,
bunch of different talking heads.
if you get a couple memes from Russia on Facebook saying, "Oh, Black Lives Matter is going to go into all the churches and shoot up everybody," that freaks everybody out. And there isn't like that one spokesperson to go on the media and say, "Oh, wait, hold up, guys, go to the website. This is what we stand for. Do you see blowing up churches as part of our agenda?" You know what I mean? So I think sometimes that a leaderless movement.
Maybe that's what the millennials need to cultivate is a leader to be like, look, you just gotta go for it.
I'm interested why
Zapatistas.
What's that?
Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico. It
I've
happened
heard
during
about
the 90s. Basically, they had a movement for autonomy within their government because they're largely indigenous. There's a lot of economic oppression, so they had, and now their movement was a violent movement. It was kind of a militia group, but their leader, he said, I kind of realized with the whole Che Guevara thing, he's like, he wore a ski mask the entire time and took on a pseudonym when addressing the public. He was the leader of the army, but nobody could know who he was. And the major part of that was it was so that he wouldn't be like idolized. He didn't want to be the guy on, that was screen printed on some, Teenage Rebels t-shirt. He wanted to refer back to his government. And I think that may be where millennials need to look. They need to, instead of having a leader, they need to look at just, hey, here's our spokesperson. He is not the governing body, or she is not the governing body.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because Antifa has similar problems, where and it's similar to the Black Lives Matter thing. You can't contradict propaganda, and there's a ton of anti-Antifa propaganda that is really easily debunked, but anybody who's involved in the movement doesn't want to out that they're in the movement.
I see.
And there's no leadership. It's a bunch of different, it's a bunch of just random people flying the same flag. They're all doing their thing under the banner of an idea. There is no leader or even a talking head that people can call and ask about things.
Yeah. I just want to go back over to BLM too, because when the riots happened here in Baltimore, BLM had been protesting down around the harbor for 10 days before that. In the spot where the riots broke out, it was clear on the other side of the city. But when you listen to local news, they made that distinction.
Right.
Because, of course, they had been covering it for that long.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to the national news and have, talking heads on, and they say, oh, well, don't forget, they've been protesting in Baltimore for 10 days, but the two had nothing to do with each other. It was that the buses got shut down and the kids didn't have anywhere to go. So they were, I don't know if Phil knows where Mondawmin Mall is.
Ooh, I've heard
City.
Not great things about Mondawmin.
Yeah, it's not great.
Yeah. Well, they got dropped off like right over near the mall, and a lot of them had to walk through other neighborhoods to get home, which if you're in Baltimore, that's not a good spot to be in.
And just kind of being a transportation guy, like that's a big no-no, just dropping people off. Because of that, because all of a sudden you'll have this mass of people who don't know where they are and they can act any kind of way.
Right. And so they got together in groups and they were, walking home together, and they deployed the SWAT team across the other side of the street because they thought they were going to do something. And so the group started getting mad. They started throwing rocks. SWAT teams started, firing back, and then it devolved the course of the day, because if you watch The Wire or really any type of media having to do with Baltimore, there's a whole 40, 50-year thing going on between the community and the city government, the police, and it just sort of boiled over, and that was what actually happened.
And I remember the media, I remember getting mad at the media because they didn't distinguish between a riot and a protest. Like you said, the protest was going on for days before the riot happened. And in fact, I think the riot was on a Monday. It was the funeral. I believe it was the funeral of Freddie Gray. Because whatever day it was, I remember the protesters sat down because in honor of Freddie Gray. I think that's why it was. So they weren't really they weren't active that day.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I mean, so it's just that was sort of. I mean, other stuff has happened, but that was my first example, because I went to college literally an exit ramp away from Baltimore. If you turned off of the university circle and just kept going, you're in Baltimore City. And so that was something, because I knew people on campus that lived in Baltimore City. That was really the first instance of that where, of course, because I was born in Baltimore, even though I live outside the city. And I had family who lived in Baltimore. And so that was the first, instance of seeing the national narrative and the local narrative, and the two were never really reconciled. And so even today, when I have conversations about that, that's a distinction that I almost always have to make. And it's just, it's interesting.
The media framed me as a civil disobedience leader in 1999. I was at the World Bank protests in DC, and they got a picture of me, and I was talking about something that I saw down the street that a bunch of black blockers were doing. And I was describing it in, with animated hand gestures and all of this, and they were like, and civil disobedience leaders, and my parents saw it. My parents were watching this, and I wasn't even in town. They called my phone every 15 minutes the entire week. Cause I was in college. So when I got back to town, my roommate was like, dude, you need to call your mom. She will not shut up. It was great. And yeah, the media, and that was kind of my experience with the media, just not knowing at all what's going on. But man, they talk a lot.
Yeah. And my main point there is just that, it's messy. That's not to take away that even people who have written op-eds since Occupy Wall Street, they will tell you how messy and unorganized it was. And so to that point, even the people in the movement agree with it, but there's also just this point that oftentimes the people participating in the movement, at least in the case of Baltimore, you're already from a community that has bad dealings, negative dealings with authority. And so when it sort of comes to a head, it's hard to sort out what exactly is going on unless you're there in real time. And that's sort of where Twitter and all these other social media tools are really interesting, because at the time, I think people were making, I can't remember if it was even the New York Times, but they were able to piece together an actual timeline just based off of what people were tweeting on different streets and video they had. And so that's, something really interesting.
So Charlotte had a similar situation. We had a protest It was a big march, police shooting. Gosh, what year was it? Was it 2015, 2016? Either way, we had an incident, and I was part of the march. And I remember, hey, son.
Hey.
So I remember how the march was definitely, it was a diverse situation, very multicultural, generational. It was almost like a kumbaya, and there was food that came out of nowhere. I don't even know who gave us the food, who gave us all lunch and water. It was a very pleasant circumstance. I was looking for this. This is the world that we inherited. So anyway, I remember that we had, everything was pleasant during the whole march. And then all of a sudden around 7:00, a whole new group of people came in that weren't part of the actual protest in the march. And that very same night, that's when there was more, violence and rioting and flipped over trash cans. And the
Yeah, I
media,
remember you posting about it.
yeah, and the media did not distinguish between everything that we did that day and with whoever came in later on that night. I remember some people wondering, like, wait, do they even live in the city? Who are those people? I don't recognize them. So
The unfortunate thing is that you can have 1,000 nonviolent protesters. One person throws a rock and it's a riot. Like that's just how it's going to be characterized.
What would the conspiracy media call it? Crisis, or the crisis-inducing actors who come in and just like mess things up, and then they leave, collect their minimum wage payment.
From George Soros.
Oh,
yes. And Bill Gates now too, apparently. Apparently Bill Gates is now one of the new targets of all the conspiracy theories.